Entreprenova Founder Webcast. Today we're going to talk about pivoting. Very interesting subject to entrepreneurs who are trying to discover new opportunities and new business models. So we're going to have a quite interesting conversation. I think loads of examples and loads of stories to tell here on the pivoting subject. So welcome, Tom. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I understand it's a little warm where you're at right now. You're kind of getting some of the American heat in the Netherlands. So kind of you came in and you actually had a little sweat on your forehead. So
Yes, it's quite warm, but finally, because we hadn't really had any heat this year yet, so that's a good thing to have a little bit of summer still.
yeah, you've had a sort of an opposite summer. We were hot and dry early on, and now it started to get a little bit more cool and wet. So yeah, so everything kind of cycles around, I guess. So
Yes, yeah, I guess,
so
I guess.
pivoting. Do we want to introduce ourselves first again for people that haven't been on?
Yeah, maybe just for a second, a very brief introduction. You want to start?
Yep, I am Tom Clement, and I'm an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at Minnesota State University in Mankato, Minnesota, and we're just about an hour south of the Twin St. Paul, and I'm entering my 21st year teaching entrepreneurship. Inga?
Yes, so my name is Inge de Dreu. I used to coach a lot of entrepreneurs. I used to teach entrepreneurship and innovation. And right now I'm dedicated to my own company, which is called Playground for Entrepreneurs. It's a serious game to be used by coaches and educators in the classroom. And it is empowering people to play with entrepreneurship and to get more original and collaborative ideas about their business. So it's a lot of fun. So let's get into our subject for today, pivoting. So you have a great definition of pivoting, I think, Tom. Do you want to share that with us?
I sort of use the basketball analogy. So, a pivot in basketball is obviously a move that you can make as a player. So, when you have a defender on you, you can pivot away from that defender. And what I usually just tell my students is pivots create options for entrepreneurs. That's really what a pivot is for. And that said, I mean, the pivot, along with things like the minimum viable product, are sort of linked to the lean startup uh, content that we hear about a lot. Although we've been doing pivots for forever in business, businesses have been pivoting forever, but it sort of got linked to the whole lean startup phase, and it's kind of a misunderstood concept. I think a lot of entrepreneurs think that a pivot, you pivot because you made a mistake or because you messed up somehow as a business owner. That's not necessarily the case. Now, certainly you can pivot away from a mistake as well. Maybe you tried something in your business, a particular marketing tactic or whatever, and it didn't work, and you can certainly pivot away from it. But usually it's just that you've scanned the information that you have about your company thus far, and you've realized that there's a segment of your company or a segment of your business model that is perhaps more lucrative or more popular than others. And you decide to go down that. It's sort of like coming to forks in the road.
Yeah.
A number of them, not just two
Yes.
forks, but a number of forks in the road. And you're choosing the right fork to go down as an entrepreneur, and that can be challenging, but it's also kind of a misunderstood concept.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It's not about giving up, right? It's not about changing your business model completely to something completely of a different subject. It's about really changing directions. You can pivot towards a better opportunity. You can also pivot away from a business model that's not working for one reason or another. Maybe it's not viable, right? Maybe it's not
Right.
making you enough money. That's a reason to pivot, but also you can just find a better opportunity. You can find a very enthusiastic market segment somewhere that you didn't expect, and you can decide that that's going to be your business from now on, or maybe both, right? So
And it gets back into that discussion we had in our last webcast about viability and feasibility. And the difference between the two, the can we do it versus should we do it. And one of the feasibility things that I think about sometimes when I think about a pivot is those individuals that are familiar with Napster. Napster was really the very first sort of online music sharing, downloading site. And just to put it completely honest, it was illegal at the time. They were violating just a pile of intellectual property rules, but they sort of set the stage to move forward with a completely new format for music. And it completely took the music industry by storm and set them off guard, actually. And it changed the way we did music from that point forward. So even though it was not really feasible from a legality perspective, it still changed the way that we did it. And they sort of pivoted into more of a legal path after they sort of gained a foothold in the industry.
Necessarily.
Yeah, right. and then of course iTunes, Apple's format, took over from there, so sort of took the baton from there. And then Apple had the name recognition and the power to be able to almost demand that the artists allow them to use their music, because it was so popular that it opened up another revenue stream for these artists. And a few resisted it for a while, but now it's just the norm, and that's just the way music is. So yeah. You had a good example of a small company that you had talked to me about earlier, and talking about a pivot.
Yes. So this was one of the first teams that I actually coached as an entrepreneurship coach. This was back in 2012, I think, late 2012. It was a starting company, two guys, and they wanted to set up a beauty salon service in Bogota, in Colombia. Now, Bogota is a big city, right? So we had to kind of choose, because beauty salon services is very big. So we went for manicures, right? Not to have the beauty specialist carrying around with all the tools and all the things that they use in beauty salons. So their business model was that this lady, this manicurist, would come to your house, they would do the manicure, and they would go on to the next customer. So the customer segments that made sense was women who are at home, who want their nails done, and who have enough money to pay for it, right? So stay-at-home women, married women very often, who wanted their nails done. So we went and we talked to these women. And it turned out that this was their plan for the day, right? Every week they would go to the beauty salon and they would enjoy that plan for the day. They would take basically all the services of the beauty salon, not just manicures, but a lot more services. They would know the specialist, the manicurist that was attending them. They would watch TV together. There's always a TV in Colombian beauty salons. They would gossip together. They would have a good time, right? She would spend all morning in that beauty salon. Now, this business model that we were developing was taking away their plan for the day to go to the beauty salon, and it was making them pay more because the service was going to be more expensive because of the cost of getting the manicurist to their home, right? Not going to work. These women have enough money to pay for it, but they're not going to do it if you're going to take their fun away, right? So then we did some observations, right? Which is another way of getting insights. And basically, I had these guys sit with a newspaper in a beauty salon like all day. And something would happen, particularly in the beauty salons in the areas of the city where there was a lot of offices. Right. So the whole morning it was kind of quiet. They were drinking coffee. Every once in a while, a customer would come in, but nothing really was happening. And then at 12 o'clock, which is the start of lunchtime in Colombia, until 2 o'clock, which is the start of going back to work, they have a 2-hour lunch break to go out and have lunch. The place would be filled.
Okay.
It would be filled with women. They were watching their clock. They were looking at. They were quite stressed, right?
Right.
They didn't know the person that was attending them. They were not watching the TV. They were just quite stressed and worried if they would even have time left to eat their lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed to get back at 2 o'clock at their company for the next meeting, and they would want to look their best with their nails painted, right? I'm not a person who
Right.
likes to paint their nails.
You didn't get into
But
that.
a lot of Colombian women did
Okay.
do. So that was really our market segment, right? These are not women who have loads of money, but they have enough money because they're professional women. And they really have a worry, a headache, right? Their worry is, do I get my nails done on time to be back? And do I get to have lunch today?
Right.
That's their worry. If they need to pay $1, $2, $3 more for that, they're happy to do it, to be sure, to get away from the stress. Right. There was another advantage, because if you go to an office area, there's not one woman who works there. There's loads of women who want to get their nails done in the same time. Right. So you can send a manicurist into the offices, and they will basically paint the nails of all the women there. So there's no transportation cost because the manicurist is already there. So at the same time, they would save cost. And they would also get more customers. So that was a pivot. We don't attend women who have a lot of money and are stay-at-home wives, basically.
Mm-hmm.
We're attending professional women who try to keep all the balls in the air, right? Who try to attend their family, have a career, study maybe a master, do sports. The very busy type of professional women who want to look good, but also have loads of things to do in their lives. So that was a great pivot for their business model.
Yes, and that was sort of a good segue too into what I was going to discuss. There are soft pivots in businesses where you're running a business like the manicurist, and you're dealing with a large group of clientele, and you make the conscious decision to focus a little bit more narrowly on one particular customer segment. That would be a relatively soft pivot. Another example of a soft pivot would be Netflix. When they transitioned from renting DVDs essentially to streaming, and they actually did both at the same time for a little while. They were still in the movie space. They were still in the video and the visual content space, but they just transitioned the way that they were delivering it to their customers. Whereas a hard pivot is a really significant, noticeable change in the direction of a company. Like, you're going one direction and all of a sudden you're going someplace almost completely different in some ways. And as you can imagine, not all hard pivots work real well. There's been some successful ones. Twitter would be an example of a successful hard pivot, where they basically started off as a podcast platform and then sort of pivoted to this kind of microblog concept. LinkedIn would be another example, where they started off as an online dating site and basically, pivoted over to more of a professionals networking type of site. But there were some really bad hard pivots. New Coke. We've all probably heard the story about New Coca-Cola back in 1985, where they took a very hard pivot away from their original formula for Coca-Cola and over to this new flavor that was supposed to compete with Pepsi. And that was an instance where they were using a lot of third-party market research data, and they just saw the market changing. And honestly, and this isn't a very much a business term, but they kind of just freaked out, and sort of lost their mind for a little while and made some really bad decisions.
The thing is, what's also so impressive in the case of New Coke, I find, is that these are smart people, right? This is an existing company, a very big company, one of the most recognized brands in the world for a very long time. It's been one of the most recognized brands in the world. These are not stupid people, right? These are smart people.
Right.
who have a lot of responsibility for their brand, and still they make that wrong decision. It's like they turn blind, right? How did it happen? How could it ever happen? Because it's not just hindsight, just at the time it also didn't make sense, and still it happened, still they decided that.
Right.
So I think the psychology behind that is really, really interesting, because it's just such a an obvious and complex case at the same time.
Well, I was distracted for a second because I was looking up the title and the author of a book. There's a really great book that I read a long time ago called Why Smart Companies Do Dumb Things. And it's avoiding the 8 common mistakes in new product development. It's written by a gentleman named Calvin Hodak. And that's a book that talks a lot about sort of the new Coke mistakes that companies make. And it's a really interesting book because you look at these really smart companies that have been around forever. And again, they should have the world by the horns, because of their intellectual property and their brand and all this stuff. And they just completely make just a blunder. Another example was Gerber Baby Food company decided to try to get into adult food, basically, like almost like baby food for adults. and it was a disaster because the brand, and he wants to eat crushed up, gross, soft baby food. Babies don't care because they're not refined eaters yet. But that was a pivot. That was a really, they called them Gerber singles, and they were a complete disaster. J.C. Penney was another example. After 2008, when the economy sort of went on the blink for a while, a lot of companies were struggling, and particularly big retail, big bricks and mortar retail. Right around 2011, J.C. Penney, which is a great old American, department store retail type company, hired a new CEO named Ron Johnson, who had worked previously for Apple and was sort of considered a kind of a retail visionary. And he decided to transition JCPenney away from the original department store concept, where you have a lot of sales flyers showing up in the newspapers, big discounts, things like that, into more of a one price model, sort of a low boutique kind of model. And it was a disaster. It just didn't work. So what I want to emphasize is that pivots should be based on using solid inside sales and business model canvas data.
Yes,
you
definitely.
should not rely on exterior. You should not always rely on. I'm not saying that can't play a role in your thinking, but if you're making your pivots based strictly on sort of looking into a crystal ball and seeing where the market is headed or where you think it's headed, we've all seen. I mean, look what happened with COVID-19. The market can change in an instant, in the snap of a finger. And by basing your pivots on that outside extraneous data, that's where a lot of these mistakes come in. And, I also want to emphasize that I recommend to most entrepreneurs that you focus more on those soft pivots. So let's say you're serving, well, let's take this podcast, for example. So we just started this podcast a couple months ago, and we're still growing and we're still gaining audience and whatever. But let's say that we get some audience analytics that shows us that there's a particular demographic of individuals that really watch and identify with what we're talking about. We may want to structure the podcast more towards those individuals in the subject matter that we choose, maybe the time of day that we broadcast the webcast, the different examples that we use. That's an example of a fairly easy soft pivot that
Definitely.
could significantly increase. You're not abandoning your other audience necessarily. You're just maybe refocusing a little bit on the group that's popular, or the ones that are really helping you to become popular.
Talking about this podcast, let's say hi to our audience for today. And there's a couple of comments coming in already. Mike says hi.
Morning, Mike. He's going to call me later. So good morning.
Mahmoud also says hi. He asks permission to respond to the comments. I think you're asking permission to comment or to ask, Mahmoud. Of course, feel welcome to interact and to write down your comments or questions, so that we can discuss them in the end. And that's always useful for the conversation and also for your information and what we can do for you.
Good
Tim
morning,
says hi.
Tim. Yep. Tim's always here.
Yeah,
Welcome back. He's a stalwart listener, watcher, whatever you
yes,
want to say. Right.
definitely, definitely. Now, as you were talking about these all these companies, Tom, I noticed that there's a lot of like the newer type of companies that pivoted towards success,
Mm-hmm.
uh, who are basically challengers of the industry, right? So
Right.
there is Twitter, turning from a podcast platform to a microblog,
Right.
Netflix, going from DVDs to streaming services. A lot of those like challengers in the industries, and that's interesting because that's, I think, a very actionable insight for new entrepreneurs. Uh, Maybe you start out with kind of a common idea. You might have a different feature than your competitors or something like that. But it's very important to identify the right opportunities and develop your vision through insights and through data, because then you can really make a difference, right? The current competitors don't have any reason anymore to innovate very
Right.
often because they might lose their market share, right? In extreme cases, that would be a case like the new Coke. They took
Right.
it to an extreme, right? But still, like the main competitors in an industry, they don't have so much reason anymore to innovate. And that's really the value of a startup. Because as a small company, you can still make those moves, right? You can turn towards new technology, or you can turn towards a new type of business model, and you can find success there. And then, well, become over time, you can become mainstream.
Well, and you can imagine like being if Coke was still a private company, for example, and they weren't so concerned about stockholders and growing the company all the time, they could make Coke for the next 100 years and not have to do another thing. And that's always also a huge factor in what they do.
Yes.
One pivot I would mention too, real quick, that I kind of forgot about, and it is the pivot of Ford Motor Company towards strictly pickups and SUVs. They got essentially out of the car business, the automobile business, and moved strictly into pickups and SUVs because despite all the moves towards electric vehicles and more energy efficient vehicles and hybrids and all that stuff, the number one selling vehicle in the United States is still the F-150 pickup. And Ford sort of realized that space is not unique to them, but it's definitely their niche.
Yeah.
And so they, as a big, huge automaker, it's been in the business for decades, decided to pivot exclusively into that SUV pickup space, which was a pretty bold move on their part. It wasn't like they weren't selling cars. They were, but they realized that they could better focus their energies
Yeah.
on a particular segment and do a better job. That's another
Definitely.
example of a really interesting pivot in
Yeah.
business.
Yes. Definitely. Definitely. So let's talk a bit about when to pivot. And I think it's really important here to also emphasize the value of a coach, or some sort of supportive, mentoring, reflective person, because that's what's going to lead you. Reflection is going to lead you to pivots, right?
Right.
So we've talked a bit about metrics and about data. Now, at the very start of your customer discovery process, there might not be such a lot of data yet.
Right.
Right? There's a lot you can do nowadays with social media and a lot with websites and everything. But still, there's also going to be a lot of qualitative data, just talking with customers, getting your insight and creating your vision from there. And a coach can really help, because sometimes in Colombia, we have a saying, the eye can't see itself, right?
Yes.
So you need somebody out from outside to sometimes kind of shake up your project, shake up your world, because sometimes it's very hard to see like the general overview, the very big strategic decisions, and where bigger opportunities can come into place. That was one of the things I really noticed when I was working with all those startups in Colombia. The quality of the coach is really a game changer. The quality of the person helping, and it's not so much about the ideas of the coach, because the coach doesn't necessarily. I used to go with my entrepreneurs to do customer discovery, but a lot of the coaches might not have time for that. But
Right.
the coach is really the one that should give you that outside and question you about those insights and question you about those data, for you to get to a better business model, to a bigger opportunity. Right? So that's going to shake up your business model. And that's the difference that a coach really can make.
Well, it's that outside perspective. I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, I'll watch back this webcast sometimes, and I just bury my head in my hands, because I have my little idiosyncrasies of the way I talk, and my Minnesota, North Dakota accent where I'm from, and I say, too much, and all these little things. And it's almost like it would be nice to have a video of your business operating every day, and the whole scan. Of course, that's not possible, but an outside set of eyes, like you said, can help the entrepreneur to identify, this might be an area that you want to look at, maybe pivoting to or putting some more emphasis on, because it's really hard to see that when you're immersed. I mean, the metaphor I've always used with my students is, if I take somebody and I drop them off in Midtown Manhattan in New York City, you look up, all you see is tall buildings around you. It's very hard to see. But if I put them up in a helicopter, they can see a lot. They can see the whole city. And that's sort of the metaphor. You want to have that glass box syndrome, where you're looking down into your business and trying to see the different directions you can go. And that's someplace that a coach can really help.
Definitely. Yeah.
Tim
I,
made a comment real quick
yeah,
about higher ed. Go ahead. You were going to mention it too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Tim made a comment about higher education. So, based on what I read, students want choices in the way classes are delivered. COVID contributed to a pivot in higher education. It will be interesting to see how all this plays out over the next few years. And that's totally right. The thing is that I think a lot of the insights that we really found in the COVID period of time, there's a lot of companies going back to the way it was before, and that's not the purpose, right? We learn something, and how can we now create the best of both worlds? It
Right.
shouldn't be the same as COVID, because now we have more freedom to move and to actually meet each other. But
Right.
how can we integrate and take the best of both of those ways of doing things? And that's going to be really interesting to see who is going to be able to do that, really. So not just go back to the
Well,
previous, but how to get the
yeah.
better business model.
Well, the interesting thing was the higher ed thing was a forced
Yeah.
pivot. And I think, especially in America, but I would say in a lot of places throughout the world, whenever you force somebody to do something, the very first reaction that they have once that crisis is over is to sort of wash their hands of it and walk
Yeah.
away and go back to the way things used to be.
Mm.
And Mike Hahn brings up a really interesting point in the comments, and this is something Mike and I've talked about personally before, with the employee crisis right now and the hiring crisis that we have with finding people to work and sort of the shortage of available workforce. Too many entrepreneurs now are stuck working in their businesses again, as opposed to on their businesses, to use the old Mike Gerber E-Myth sort of analogy where you work on your business and not in your business. That's a really interesting point that he's made to me that I'd never really thought about before, that these entrepreneurs now are so busy and harried working in their companies because they can't find people to work, that they don't have time to sort of do that glass box thing and work on their business and look at it. And they may not be able to identify the pivots. I don't know. I shouldn't say I don't know. I'm pretty confident we're not going to solve that workforce problem here. But I would also emphasize that that's even more reason to have good coaching around you. Because even though the entrepreneur is immersed in their company, much like they may have been when they first started their company. So I mean, when entrepreneurs first start up, and you can attest to this, Inga, you're just buried.
Yeah.
You're over your
And
head.
you need to
and
do a
it's
little
really
bit of
hard to see around
everything,
you.
right? So
Yes, you do
whatever
everything from cleaning the bathrooms
whatever
to
is not being done, that's what you need to do.
right.
Yeah.
And a lot of entrepreneurs might be in their 5th, 6th year of business or 3rd or 4th year of business, and they're sort of back to that again. And that's even more reason to rely on some outside help. Somebody even like me, I mean, I don't charge. I'm a entrepreneurship prof at a university. I'll help you for nothing. You come and talk to me. I mean, at least I could take a look at your business and say, hey, why don't we take a look at this? Or why don't we think about this? Whereas you're so immersed in your company that you might not be able to see. It's that old analogy. You can't see the forest from the trees. And that's the position you find yourself in.
I just want to make one more comment on the COVID part. Not sure if there's been some news going on Zoom. So Zoom is calling people back to the office. I'm not sure if we would call that a pivot, but the messaging is definitely a bit strange, right? As a company promoting remote work, how can you do that?
Right.
So that's something else that COVID changed things. So how can we make it work? So if the way that Zoom works remotely is not effective for them, they have all the reason to actually notice that. But calling everybody back to the office and having them clock their time is probably not going to be the right answer. And especially not the right message to their customers.
Right.
So that's another thing that can lead to a business model that's just, in this case, the marketing message and the value proposition is just different to their company culture, which is not a good thing.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch that play out and see what happens there. And it could be another one of those corporate blunders that ends up being an article somewhere down the road about what not to do. In those situations.
Yes.
Looks like we're out of time again. We use up our half hour in a hurry, don't we?
Definitely. So yes, it's been interesting to have this conversation. There's just so many cases and so many pivots worth mentioning, really, and so many actionable things you can do with pivots. So I hope this answers some of your questions and gives you a bit of insight into this pivoting theme, just because it can generate so much value and so much innovation into business models, which I think is great.
Well, and for educators, coaches, entrepreneurs, it's not always easy to think of some of these examples. So watching a pivot happen, or at least seeing it in real time, even if it's retroactively, is a lot easier to envision. Hey, maybe we could do something like this with our business down the road, or maybe we can show an entrepreneur how to do this the right way or the wrong way, so they don't make a mistake. Down the road and pivot too hard or pivot too late. So there's a lot of different things there that they can learn from that.
Definitely.
Excellent.
So great. It was interesting to have this conversation.
Yep.
And we hope to see you in the next one. If you have any questions or comments, do let us know in the chat. We will answer those and read those back. So it was great to have you all here attend this session.
Yeah, and join us again in a couple of weeks for another edition of the Entreprenova Webcast.
Definitely. So thank you for attending again, and have a great day. See you the next
Have a good
one.
rest of your week.